I've been asked multiple times about who, what, where, why, how. So I'm going to briefly reminisce about my time as editor-in-chief of the Arab News. Stick around and enjoy. Today, I'm going to talk about something which is very dear to me, of how I became the editor of the Arab News. Recently, I was sitting with my grandchildren, and one of them asked me of how I became the editor-in-chief of the Arab News. It's a question I've been asked many times, and it's a long story. The story occurred like this. It started with a visit to Mr. Ayad Madani, who was the general manager of Okaz Publications, and I was in his office. And then he asked me whether I could go for an editor's meeting with the late King Khalid in Taif. I never worked in a newspaper. I was not working there. And he said that the editor-in-chief is not there and we want somebody to represent the Saudi Gazette. So I went in a car. They took 4 editors at one time. Mr. Muhammad Ma'ruf al-Shaybani, who was the editor-in-chief of the Sharq al-Awsat, Dr. Hashim Abdul Hashim, who was the editor-in-chief of Okaz, and the late Abdul Aziz Nihari, who was the editor-in-chief of Al-Bilad. And we went in the car, and then I struck up a conversation with Mr. Shaybani, who was the editor-in-chief of the Arab News at that time. And somehow or the other, when we reached Taif, the late King Khalid could not see us, so they asked us to come again after 2 days. The same group went in the same car, and I just forgot all about it. A week later, Mr. Muhammad al-Shaybani called me and asked me for dinner. And during dinner, he said to me that they would like me to be the editor-in-chief of the Arab News. Now, I used to read the Arab News. I was working in Saudi in the marketing division, and I said, okay, let me think about it, because I knew good English. I could write English, alhamdulillah, thanks to my father, who was a great lover of the English language from the age of 9 or 10. But I never worked in a newspaper. So I thought about it. And then I went to see the publishers, the legendary brothers, Hisham and Muhammad Ali Hafiz. I knew a lot about the Hafiz family. Their parents, their father, Sheikh Ali Hafiz, then Sheikh Usman Hafiz, were pioneers in media or in journalism, as they used to call that, for many, many years. I went to the office, and there was Mr. Hisham Hafiz sitting, and Mr. Muhammad Ali. And Hisham took out a small piece of paper and said, name your salary. I had never worked in a paper. I didn't know the salary scale of how much an editor takes. So I went back to some other people. They said, we have no idea. I went to Mr. Ayad Madani, who just stared at me and said, think about it. Anyway, I threw a figure and went back after a week, and they said, done. So that's how I was able to start my first day at the paper. Now, speaking of my first day in a newspaper, it was literally my first day ever in a newspaper itself. I was given a room. It was 5 feet by 6 feet with a large bin, and I didn't know why this bin was there. And then I saw people coming. I was introduced to the staff, and I sat down, and they would bring newspaper clippings to me, and also clippings from Reuters, AP, and on, which I had to initial. In the evening, Mr. Abdul Hadi Bafagir, who was the head of the print shop, came to my room and said, "Kam bunt," in Arabic. I had no idea what a bunt was. So I called the tea boy, Abdurrahman from Kerala, who came and told me that a bunt is font in English, but in Arabic they call it bunt. So he explained to me that headlines have 40 fonts, 40 fonts and 30 fonts and 20. So I gave him 100 riyals, and for the next 3 days, he was teaching me how to make pages. Now, I'm not supposed to do pages, because as an editor, you don't do pages. But at the same time, I have to know what's going on. So that was my first day in the paper. A few days later, the Israelis went into Lebanon, 1982, and then I wrote an article, and then I wrote an editorial. So one of the American gentlemen came to me and said, "Who wrote this editorial?" And I said, "I did." And he looked at me and said, "You wrote this?" And I said, "Of course I did." because you see what he thought, that editors have to be Saudis by law, and this guy has been brought in to head the paper. So after that, I had a very healthy relationship with him, and we discussed many things, including the elements of metaphysics and all that. The group in Arab News was composed mainly of Indians, Lebanese, a couple of Egyptians. Jihad al-Khazin used to write Good Morning. And so you see, we had a good group, small paper. Circulation was about 9,000. It used to have one print, but it carried the news of the day. Later on, as the months passed by, I changed it. I added letters to the edit column, sports, a bit of news, and started slowly getting in Saudis to write. Not because they were Saudis, but we wanted to give it a local touch. In the days when there were no satellites and no channels and no iPhones and no Samsungs and all, the Arab News was the sole provider of news for the expatriates who were living in the kingdom. And this is what we started to do. Page one changed, we added new columns, guest columns, and became a part and parcel of society. And having a Saudi as head of the paper with some other Saudis inside, and the support of the two brothers, Hisham and Muhammad Ali Hafiz, who I must say never interfered in the running of the paper or the other papers they had. The Arab News gave birth to the Sharq al-Awsat in 78, then Al-Majalla, Al-Muslimun, Sayyidati. So it was the vanguard of the Saudi research and publishing company. And as such, I think that was the start. In September, we had the issue of Sabra and Shatila, where we covered. During this period also, we had the World Cup. And being somebody who likes sports, not football, still we focused on the human aspects of the World Cup. We focused on several other issues. Slowly, we began to move out. I was from Jeddah, then I was also, in many ways related to the sports scene, the Ittihad Club, the Ahli Club. So these people who were there started reading. Coming from a business family, also with business people, I would go around. It was all about real public relations management, to go around and telling people that this is a paper, a Saudi paper, giving a Saudi viewpoint, and we need your support. So the focus in the early part of the 80s was on the expatriates, but as we went through the mid-80s, more and more Saudis who were outside the kingdom and coming back, not like now, but coming back, they started reading this paper. Our competitor was the Daily Star from Beirut, but it used to come a day late or sometimes late at night. Standard was good. Many incidents happened during this period. We were able to cover quite a few of them. I was also lucky to get many other Saudis in the company, like Mr. Wahib Orab, who was the correspondent for the Gulf. He took me around the Gulf countries, introduced me to so many of the Gulf leaders, the sheikhs, those in power. And as such, the Arab News brand was being slowly planted in the area of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Our coverage widened. We started to cover local and international news. We had reporters all across the world. Many of them were freelance. And then, of course, the Falkland War occurred. We started calling it the Malvinas War. This really upset the large number of British people who were here because they called it the Falklands. And there were many letters to the editor. Also, there was, for the first time ever, the letter from the British ambassador, Sir James Craig, who wrote and was critical of our coverage of the war. But it boosted our circulation. That was one of the issues that we really were aiming at. So we promoted Arab News, the first English language daily, by its own content and its own editorial outlook and philosophy. Later on, then we had the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Yasser Arafat came here at the invitation of the late King Fahd. I met him at 3 a.m. and we had an interview with him along with Sayyid Abdullah Jifri for our sister publication Al-Majalla. And then we went with him to the studio. I remember it was about 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, and he was appearing on 60 Minutes, and I was sitting right next to him, writing on a white piece of paper what he had to say. His syntax was not that good, so he would always use the word the Israeli military junta, and I would write the Israeli government. So these were the things that propped up Arab news. Then, of course, I remember having gone to Berlin in 1988 and sitting in the office of one of the papers across the line, the divide, the Berlin Wall, and I asked one of the editors whether Germany would be united, and he said, not in my lifetime. But then the wall went down next year. So you see, journalism was such that you expected heady days, you expected things that never occurred. There were assassinations. Mrs. Indira Gandhi was killed. Ziaul Haq went down in a plane. Other issues were happening. And all this was going on, and the Arab news was gaining more and more momentum. We were getting readership. Of course, we never wanted incidents to happen so that our coverage would go up. We were humanists, but we began to cover other areas and other countries, other issues from a Saudi and an Arab perspective. And this, in fact, made people happy. They made a large number of Saudis happy. They had an English language paper run by Saudis in Saudi Arabia, having an impact across its borders. This was my first decade at the helm of affairs as editor-in-chief of the Arab News. Many things happened in the 80s. Many more things were to happen in the 90s, of which I will relate to you in future episodes.